That, of course, the big story of the day, Mitt Romney. What are the US papers making of his victory?
Well, the big question they're asking is Newt Gingrich going to give up now? Michael Tomasky in the Daily Beast says that effectively the battle is over. Whether Gingrich chooses to drag it out until June or not is his choice, and in the end it will only be embarrassing for him if he chooses to do so, and of course destructive to the Republican Party as a whole and damaging to their chances of winning the general election against Barack Obama. Now, the result proves two things, he says. One, that there just aren't as many Tea Party-leaning voters in the Republican primary electorate as we perhaps thought there were a few months ago when there was all this publicity around them. And secondly, that $16 million spent on attack ads in Florida alone, which is what Romney has spent, works. The money works, he says. And Romney, of course, has a huge amount of money behind him, along with the whole Republican Party establishment. And if Gingrich chooses to keep fighting this for the next few months, he can keep throwing money at him. Gingrich is never going to claw back the advantage, but it just depends how long he drags this out for, really. Now, Conservatives are worried that dragging it out will indeed damage the whole Republican Party, that if they're attacking each other rather than Obama for months to come, it will look bad. And in fact, the papers are full of Conservatives begging Gingrich to pull out now. Look at this article by Meghan McCain, daughter of John McCain, of course, who ran for the Republicans in 2008. She's written a piece for the Daily Beast, basically begging him to pull out, saying if you don't, you will destroy the Republicans' chances of winning, and he's only doing it now for his own ego if he doesn't.
The Democratic supporting side of the press presumably quite happy about this, though.
Well, the New York Times says the longer Gingrich stays in, the more his team will be doing the work that Obama's team need to be doing. That is, highlighting all of Romney's weaknesses, the things that make him look out of touch with ordinary voters, his high income, his low taxes, his work for Bain Capital, all that kind of thing. And the more, of course, Romney and Gingrich attack one another with vicious attack ads and really strong negative language, the more the Obama campaign can use that to attack their character, their credibility, and the less they'll be sort of accessible to floating voters, the less they'll be inclined to win over moderate people, because, of course, they'll be forced further to the right to win over those Republican voters. The Huffington Post making a similar point in an article today, saying the Democrats will use the same tactics against Mitt Romney that he has used against Newt Gingrich, and they mean very strongly personal, very negative campaigns.
OK, away from the primaries then, Syria are also making the newspapers around the world.
Yes, look at this strong front page from the Lebanese newspaper L'Orient Le Jour. It's the Arab countries' call on the UN to end the killing machine in Syria. They say they've spoken to a colonel of the Free Syrian Army, which of course is partly based in Lebanon, and he reckons 50% of Syria is now out of the control of Assad's government. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean it's part of a coherent alternative state. They say the opposition is still very fragmented, they lack means, they lack manpower, they're finding it difficult to organise themselves, and lots of these towns that have declared themselves independent are still being besieged by pro-Assad tanks. So the situation on the ground is very complicated. The Independent's veteran Middle East correspondent Robert Fisk is saying today that Assad still has a huge amount of advantages that we shouldn't forget. He's got international support, he's got Iran backing him, for example, and other countries like Israel might not be keen on him, but they don't necessarily want to see him go either, because they're worried he could be replaced by something more extremist.
It's a big British story around today. You've pulled this one off the front of the Independent.
Yes, look at this front page. Dishonoured is the big headline, and there is Fred Goodwin, Fred the Shred. Of course, he used to run the Royal Bank of Scotland that was virtually nationalised in 2008 after his universally called dreadful management. He was stripped of his knighthood by the Queen yesterday in what's a very, very rare measure, unless someone has actually committed a criminal offence. But the Independent says in their editorial, why stop with him? If we're going to be picking out scapegoats for the financial crisis, then all the politicians who were in charge, the cabinet ministers at the time, should be stripped of their honours, and so should all the heads of all the other banks. Now, for the Times, of course, they see things rather differently. They've got disgraced Goodwin is stripped of knighthood on this front page, and in their editorial they say if we're going to do things like this kind of mob rule justice, they call it, then that makes Britain look bad for business. It's not going to encourage any banks to come and work there. They say it's childish and a silly move.
Dame Elena Casas with the newspapers every day here on France 24. Thanks very much. Still to come, in fact, we're staying on that subject. Fallen Knight, the UK banker, they called Fred the Shred, stripped of his title. More on that coming up then in the business after the break.
Since the protests began in Syria, the regime has been trying to hide its bloody crackdown by making it impossible for journalists to work. But our reporters Karim Akiki and Adel Gastel managed to cross the border and infiltrated a group of rebel protesters. Don't miss these exclusive reports from within the rebellion in Syria. Since the protests began in Syria, the regime has been trying to hide its bloody crackdown by making it impossible for journalists to work. But our reporters Karim Akiki and Adel Gastel managed to cross the border and infiltrated a group of rebel protesters. Don't miss these exclusive reports from within the rebellion in Syria.